next speaker will be Satya Majumdar, who will talk about stochastic resetting.
Okay, thank you, Corina. And so let me start by thanking the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Newton Institute, as always. And so I'm going to talk about stochastic resetting. So it's a sort of relatively new area in statistical physics, about 10 to 12 years old. But in the last 10 years, it has seen a lot of development, both theoretically and experimentally, and as well as finding new applications across disciplines from physics, mathematics, biology, and computer science, etc. And so what I wanted to do is to give you an overview of these developments over the last, last decade, just to tell you why this problem is interesting and so on. And I should say that, I'm a physicist, and I realized that, this talk was sort of prepared in the physicist language, so it's by no means formal or, rigorous in a mathematical sense. But I hope I can get across the main ideas to you. And if something is not clear, please ask. I'll be happy to clarify. Okay, so here's the outline of my talk. So I'll start with a sort of brief introduction to stochastic resetting, mainly what are the motivations. And then I'll talk about I'll illustrate these ideas in a very simple toy model. And there will be three outcomes of this toy model. So there will be a new non-equilibrium stationary state. And I'll explain to you what I mean by those things. And there will be an unusual temporal relaxation towards this stationary state, so unusual dynamics. And then we'll talk about something about the optimal search time to find a target, and explain again. And then, I'll talk about some recent experiments using optical tweezers. Physicists always get sort of excited when there are experiments because there are some new questions which come up and so on. And then I'll talk about the generalization to many body systems because this is for a single particle here. And then I'll generalize to many body system, and then I'll summarize and conclude and talk about some open, interesting areas, new directions. Okay, so let's get started. So just as a general motivation first, there are two principal motivations. So the first one is the growth of a city, for example, the population of a city or the size of the city. This is sort of Manhattan in 1609. And you see as time grows, it sort of grows, and so the population sort of almost exponentially grows with time. And this is not just Manhattan, it can be any city actually. And similarly, you can do a controlled experiment in the lab where you actually grow bacteria on a petri dish. So you start with the bacteria, these bacteria multiply, the cells divide and multiply, and then the population grows again exponentially with time. And now, if it was just growing, then it would be boring. But what happens is that there are extreme events, which are rare events, like, for example, earthquake or tsunami or I don't know, typhoon, etc., which actually are rare events. They do not happen all the time, but when they occur, their effects can be devastating, and it can wipe out, for example, the population of a city. And typically, you see that this is the sort of population size. This is a schematic graph. So you see that with time, the population is increasing exponentially almost. And then some catastrophic event occurs, and the population size goes almost down to zero. And this is the sort of resetting, basically. And these reset events occur at random times. So in that sense, this is a stochastic resetting. And then again, it grows. And then again, at some random time, again, some catastrophic event happens, and it comes down, and so on. And it goes on. So there are two competing effects, population growth and resetting. And so one of the questions here is that will the population size stabilize at long times? Is there any stationary state if I look at the distribution of the population? And if so, what can we, how do we characterize such a stationary state? And this problem is particularly sort of important in biology, because what happens there, as in this example, the people are interested in this stabilization of the superbugs. These days there are bacteria which are antibiotic resistant, and the way it occurs is that the bacteria multiply, and then you apply antibiotics, which kills the bacterial population size. So you can think of applying the antibiotics here, and it kills the bacterial population size. But then one or two bacteria, they mutate, and then they start growing again. And again, you apply the antibiotic, and again it sort of goes away, but one or two remain, and then they restart and becomes a growth. And so, and the superbug population, is a very extreme effect. I mean, in some sense, this is the biggest cause of death across the hospitals in all over the world. And so, in medical science, this is an important problem to know whether such a superbug population stabilize at long times or not. Is there a stationary state and things like that, to characterization of that. Okay? So this is the sort of first motivation. The second motivation actually comes from search problems. As you know, search problems are ubiquitous in nature. So animals searching for food, or a helicopter searching for survivors after a shipwreck, or even protein searching for a site to bind on a DNA, or even more mundane example, when you are writing a computer program and you are looking for a bug, debugging your computer program. And so in all these problems, it's quite natural that, if you have searched for a while and you haven't found the target, maybe your natural intuition tells us that, maybe you should stop the search and restart from the beginning. Because the chances are that you might find a different pathway to explore, and you might find the target, whatever you are looking for, much more easily. And for example, if you're writing your computer program, debugging your program, then you get lost in subroutines and so on, and then you just take a coffee break and start from the beginning, and the chances are that you might find the bug more easily. Okay? And in fact, I mean, this is also happens in visual search. So imagine that you are looking for the face of a friend in a sort of big crowd like this. So how do our eyes search for the face? Okay, it doesn't scan from one end to the other. What it does, it starts from some random point here. It searches locally, just does diffusion, and then it comes back and it doesn't come back, and then it sort of restarts on a random trajectory again. And it typically does this. In fact, I mean, the psychologists, they do experiments. So this is the experiment is the following. So they show the patient a big blackboard with lots of letters which are all P, except that there is one B in this milieu. Okay, and they are asked to find this B, and they put fit a camera in the eye and ask them to search, and then they look at how the trajectories behave. Okay, so and again they don't scan from one. Typically, people don't scan from one end to the another. They start at some random point, and basically what it does. So this is what you find is schematically, this is the search trajectory. So you start from this point, you do a random walk in space up to some random steps, and you come back to the starting point and you restart a new trajectory, okay? And again do it search for random time, and again you come back, and so on and so forth. And in case you haven't found the B, it's here. So the other example is actually, this is a very practical example, which is, so imagine that you have a multi-dimensional landscape. So the horizontal axis are just the level of a configuration, if you like, and this is the energy of a configuration. And for example, the spin glass or any other disordered systems. And so what happens is that, in simulated annealing, what it means is that you start from a given configuration, so this point, let's say here, and you make some local moves. For example, you can flip a spin locally, and so the configuration changes. So you move in this configuration space from one configuration to another configuration by local moves, okay? And your goal is to find the global ground state, that means the global minimum here. And so, but what happens is that typically you might get stuck in a metastable configuration for a very long time, okay? So what people empirically do, they do exactly that. That is, when they are stuck in this thing, they just, restart again starting configuration. And again, the rationale is that now if you start again this new trajectory, you might explore a different pathway, and maybe you will reach the global minimum much faster, okay? So there are these, empirically people have been doing that, and they find that indeed this kind of stochastic resetting, it helps to find the target, it reduces the search time, but there was no quantitative estimate for this. So this is the question then. Does stochastic resetting help in searching a target? And does it really reduce for example, the mean search time of the target? Okay. Okay, so let me just summarize so far. So essentially there are two principal issues when a system with its own natural dynamics. So imagine any system actually, it is very general. You can have any system with its own natural dynamics, and once in a while you do the stochastic resetting. That means you go back to the initial configuration after some random time. And so the two questions are, does the system reach a stationary state at long times? And if so, how do we characterize the stationary state? Or how does it approach the stationary state? And the second thing is that it does the stochastic resetting make a random search process efficient. Okay? So these are the two questions we wanted to understand. And with these sort of motivations in mind, I mean, we wanted to understand this in a very simple toy model where you can actually do the calculations. So about, a few years back, about 12 years back, with Martin Evans, my colleague from the University of Edinburgh, so we decided to, study a very, very simple model. And let me just describe you this toy model, and because it already teaches us something. So what is this model? So the model is very simple. So imagine that, okay, I'll define it in one dimension, but you can, of course, define it in any dimension, if you like. For simplicity, I'll just stick to one dimension. So imagine that this is a line, and you start a Brownian motion, actually, or random walk in discrete time, or a Brownian motion, if you like, at some initial position x0. And this does diffusion up to a random time. And this random time is typically drawn from a exponential distribution. So it's a Poissonian process with rate r. And then after this random time, you just reset to the initial position x0. And then again, you choose a random number from this distribution, which is the time of your evolution. And again, you evolve, and again, you reset, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's all. It's a very simple model. So if you're doing computer simulation in discrete time, so in a small time interval delta t, you update the position. You either go back to x0 with probability r delta t. R is the rate, so the r delta t is the probability. And the complementary probability 1 minus r dt, you just do diffusion. And this eta t is a Gaussian white noise with zero mean and a delta correlator. So in the mathematics language, this is just dBt. Okay. So that's all the model. So R is the only parameter in this simple model, okay, resetting rate. And so first question you wanted to ask is that what is the position distribution? That means what is the probability? This is the probability density. What's the probability density that the particle will be at x at time t, starting from the initial value x0? And this is a Dirac delta function, which is the initial condition. So you all know that when resetting is not there, that means without resetting, this is just a Brownian diffusion. Therefore, the propagator, or if you like, the position distribution, starting from x0, is just a simple Gaussian with mean at x0 and the variance, which is 2 dt. D is the diffusion constant. And now the question is that when I switch on this resetting rate r, what happens to this PR of xt? Okay. So the answer is actually very simple, because you can easily write down, and this is the only equation I'll sort of use in my talk. So you can easily write down a sort of Fokker-Planck equation for the evolution of this PR of xt. So in this Fokker-Planck equation, on the left-hand side, you have a del p del t. On the right-hand side, in blue, so this is the usual diffusion term, the diffusion equation. This will be the diffusion equation, if you like. But now there is a resetting. So this is a sort of Markov process. So essentially, if you are at position x at time t, with rate r, you go away from this position x. So therefore, there is a loss term here, minus rpr of xt. And there will be a gain term, because if you are at some other position, then from there, by resetting, you can come to x0. And this contributes to the thing only if you are at x equal to x0. So therefore, there is a Dirac delta function sitting here. And you sum over, integrate over all other positions from where you come. And since the total probability is conserved, so that is 1 essentially. So you have essentially this term. So the terms in red is essentially the new terms. So when r is 0, of course, you have this standard diffusion. Okay? And this is the initial condition. So this is a very simple equation. It's a linear equation with a source term. You can easily solve by Fourier transform and Fourier and Laplace transform. I'll not go into the details. But the exact solution of this equation can be written in a very suggestive form, which is essentially the renewal equation. So let me just explain to you. So this exact solution of this equation you can write in this form. There are two terms in this equation. Let me explain each of these terms. So what is this first term here? So the first, so you imagine that you have a, you can have a configuration where you started from x0 and you arrive at x, but without any resetting event at all. The probability for that, since it's the Poissonian process, is just e to the power minus RT. So with this probability, there is no resetting, and then it's just a bare propagation, which is, this is the diffusion propagator. So it just, there is no resetting, so it just goes there straight away. The second term is when one or more resettings occur, and in that case, you can use this renewal interpretation, because what happens is that, after every resetting, the process renews itself. So all I need to look at is the last resetting before time t, because I know that after the last resetting, the particle has relocated at x naught, and after that it's just a free diffusion, since this is the last resetting event. Now what is the, so p naught x tau, so tau is the time since the last resetting, it's a random variable. So during that time, you have just a bare diffusion propagator. And what is the probability that this random variable tau, what's the probability that the last resetting occurs between tau and tau plus d tau? So that is just, e to the power minus r tau is the probability that there is no resetting, followed by one resetting event in this time tau to tau plus d tau, which is r d tau. And then this tau can be anything from 0 to t, and so you have to integrate over this. So that's it. So this is this very, very simple solution, and you can check that this solution explicitly, that it satisfies the Fokker-Planck equation that I wrote down, this equation, okay? So this is the sort of exact solution at any time. But nice thing is this renewal interpretation that it should be generalizable to other processes, which I'll come back later. All right? So now from this equation, you see immediately that if I now take the t goes to infinity limit, that this term drops out and this integral becomes 0 to infinity, and as long as this integral exists, which it does in this case, it's just a simple integral. You just put this Gaussian here, and it's just a Laplace transform, and it turns out to be just a double exponential form with a length scale, which is square root over d over r. So alpha naught is the inverse length scale. Okay. So therefore, this system actually reaches a stationary state in the long time limit, and this stationary state is non-Gaussian. So its shape is like this. So it has a cusp at x equal to x naught initial position, because with resetting you are trying to dynamically send the particle towards the starting point. Okay. So there's a there's a pile of density, if you like, at x naught. Okay, but it's being generated dynamically, and then it sort of decays exponentially, but not Gaussian. It just decays exponentially as you go away from x equal to x naught. Okay. Now, this is a non-equilibrium stationary state. What do I mean by non-equilibrium? Non-equilibrium usually means that when there is no detail balance, that means in the configuration space, if I look at, then there is a non-zero probability current which flows in the stationary state. Okay, so this is a current carrying, and this is very easy to understand why detail balance is violated here, because by resetting move, you can go from some arbitrary position to x naught, but there is no reverse move there. Okay, so obviously the current is non-zero, and yet it reaches a stationary state. So such stationary states which carry currents and yet stationary, these are called non-equilibrium stationary states. So even though this probability density has the sort of form of an effective Gibbs state with an effective potential which is modulus of x minus x naught, but still it is non-equilibrium because there is a non-zero current, probability current in the configuration space. So this was our prediction 12 years back, and very recently this prediction here was actually verified in the experiments using holographic optical tweezers, and I'll come back to the experiments later from the group of Yael Reichman at Tel Aviv University. And why this is interested in when there is more experiment is that experiments are not just to to check the theory, but they also give rise to new questions. I'll come back to that a little bit later, and we'll see that there are some new interesting questions which come out of experiments. All right. So this is the stationary state. So in this simple model, we know that there is a stationary state. Okay. So now let's ask, how does it relax to the stationary state? Okay. We have the exact solution at all time t. So you just have to analyze that. And if you analyze that integral for finite but large t, what you find is very interesting. So here I plot, so what happens is that this is the space and this is the time, okay? So this is the x naught, initial position. So what happens at any finite but fixed time t, if I look at my PR, if I just scan across x and look at how this probability density behaves as a function of x, what you find is that as long as this, the time, x minus x naught, this distance, is less than psi of t, where psi of t is a function that grows linearly with time, so that's why it's kind of a light cone here, okay, with a speed which grows like square root of 4 dr. So as long as you are inside this light cone, that is this purple region here, the distribution essentially becomes independent of time, okay, so it's just a stationary distribution. But outside this, in this green regime here, So there, it's still time dependent. Okay, so all the activity or dynamics is going on, just outside the light cone here. Okay, so physically, what this means that the trajectories which arrive here, these are the trajectories which have undergone lots of resets, whereas trajectories which are outside the light cone, they have undergone very few resets. Okay, 1 or 2 or maybe 0 resets. Okay, so therefore, this light cone is like a separatrix that separates between the trajectories which have undergone many resets and the trajectories which have undergone no or very few resets. Okay, and so essentially what happens is that as time grows, so the stationary state gets established on longer and longer length scale, and this is how this relaxation to the stationary state occurs. And at long time limit, of course, everything becomes stationary. Okay, and interestingly, so if you are close to this light cone, so imagine that I fix t and I increase x, t large t basically, and large x minus x naught with the ratio kept fixed. That means I'm looking at very close to this, zoom in around the light cone here, and I just analyze my integral there. And what you find is that it has a large deviation form, exponential minus t, some function of this thing, where this rate function f, if you plot, this rate function f has this behavior. So it's actually linear up to this u star, which is the speed of this light cone. And beyond this, it becomes quadratic. Okay? And in fact, what you find is that the second derivative of this function, this rate function, is discontinuous at this critical point. And this is what physicists call the dynamical phase transition. There is a second order dynamical phase transition because the second derivative is discontinuous of this rate function. Okay? So if it was pure diffusion, it would be quadratic all the way. There won't be any phase transition. So, so the dynamics to this stationary state is also interesting, and there is a critical point that comes out from the resetting essentially. Okay? So this is the sort of relaxation to the stationary state. And now I come to the third point, which is the second motivation, the target search. Does stochastic resetting really help in finding a target? Okay? So let me just recall you first what happens when there is no resetting. And suppose that we are in 1D, so I'm just looking at just a 1D Brownian motion, starting at x naught, and imagine that there's a target now, which is at the origin, is a fixed target, it's not moving. And the job of this searcher is to perform Brownian motion random search, and it stops when it finds the target, and the stopping time is the first passage time, essentially. So this first passage time, obviously a random variable, it fluctuates from one realization to another realization, and you can ask, what is this distribution? And this is a classical problem, goes back to Levy, and so what you find is that the probability distribution of this random variable Tf, okay, so I'm using physicist notation. Ideally, you should say random variable equal to takes this value, but okay, we just write it like this. So Tf, so probability that the first passage takes the value Tf, given that it started at x naught. So this is actually given exactly by this simple formula, and which for fixed x naught, and if you take the large Tf limit, it has a fat tail, it has a power law tail, which decays as Tf to the power minus 3 by 2. So the distribution is normalizable, of course, because this is a normalized distribution, but its first moment and all the higher moments, they are infinite. Okay? So this is a sort of Levy law, essentially. And so it was first derived by Levy, and then in the physics literature, it was used by Chandrasekhar, and then, of course, you can find in Taylor's book. This is a very classical result. Okay? But the interesting point here is that the mean first passage time, that is the mean time to find the target, is actually infinite for 1D Brownian motion. Okay? And so even though the probability is normalizable to 1, which means that it will definitely find the target, but the mean time to find the target is infinite. Okay? And this is because of this power law tail here, it decays as to the power 3 by 2, making this first moment divergent. So, and physically this means that why this diverges is because essentially there are trajectories which go, so target is here, there are some trajectories which have a non-zero weight which go into the the other side essentially, and they contribute to the mean, making the mean divergent, because if it goes to the other side, these are bad guys basically, so they go in the other direction. So in that case, they contribute infinite time to find the target because they don't find the target. Okay? So when you calculate the average value, it actually diverges. Okay? So now if you switch on the resetting, what resetting does is they cut off those bad trajectories. Okay? I mean, because by resetting, you are coming back to the origin, and thereby, it actually improves the mean first passage time. To see this, so what you have to now solve, again, the same problem, but now in the presence of resetting R. And I'll not go through the solution because the solution is quite simple. You can just calculate by renewal properties the first passage problem. So I'll not go into the details. You can find in this paper, but you can actually calculate the mean first passage time. And now, first thing that happens is the mean first passage time now is finite. Okay, so you see from this formula that it diverges when R goes to 0. Okay, when R goes to 0, it diverges like 1 over square root of R. Okay, but for finite R, it's actually non-zero R. It's actually a finite number. Okay, so that itself says that it's now in a on an average in a finite time it will find the target, and resetting helps because it cuts off those bad trajectories. Okay. But what it says is also interesting, that this function, if you plot it as a function of R for fixed x0, you see that it diverges as 1 over square root of R when R goes to 0, but it also diverges when R goes to infinity. Okay? So both sides it diverges. And this is easy to understand because, as I said, R goes to 0 limit, it diverges because there are these bad trajectories which go in the opposite direction, okay, making the mean time to find the target infinite. On the other hand, if the resetting rate is very large, you are resetting all the time, R is very large, which means that you are essentially localized around the initial position. So you hardly move from this initial position, and again, you miss the target, and therefore it diverges on this end also. And in fact, if you plot this function, what you find is that there is a unique minimum here at some R equal to R star, which you can find just by taking derivative and setting it to 0. So what it says is that not only that the mean first passage time is finite, but there is even an optimal value of the resetting rate R star for a fixed position x0 that makes the, that minimizes the mean search time. Okay, so this is actually very nice because it says that that if you set your resetting rate to this value R star, you will find the target in a very, so it sort of really improves the search time of this random search process of the target. Okay, so. And in fact, the same conclusion holds in a higher dimension also. Say, for example, in d bigger than 2, of course, you cannot have a point target for a Brownian motion. You have to put a target with a finite size a cutoff. Otherwise, the Brownian motion will always miss a point target with probability 1. And so now you can again say that, okay, your searcher starts at R0, and it does the Brownian diffusion, and then with rate R, it comes back to the starting point, and it continues. And again, you can compute very easily. I'll not go into the computation. Mean first passage time in terms of modified Bessel functions, but the main conclusion is that once again that for in any dimension d, you find that there is an optimal R star. Of course, R star depends on d. R star that minimizes the t bar, the mean first passage time. Okay. So therefore, the fact that there is an optimal R star exists. I mean, this is true in any dimension. Okay. And so this was actually quite nice, and this sort of. So what we learned from this simple toy model, there are 3 basic facts. So one thing is that there is a non-equilibrium stationary state, which you can explicitly characterize. There is an unusual temporal relaxation to the stationary state, which is accompanied by a dynamical phase transition in the rate function. And also, there is an existence of an optimal resetting rate R star, which makes a diffusive search efficient in the presence of resetting. So these 3, the things that you learned from this toy model, so they were very interesting, and this actually led to a lot of activities. I'll not go into all the details, but just to sort of give you a flavor of these things. That so people actually found this existence of an R star, optimal R star. This actually was very useful and in search process in many different areas. And also the facts that there is a stationary state, and people started applying this resetting problem dynamics to many different problems in quantum dynamics, in active particles, and this optimal strategy for animal movements and so on. It's a very long list. So if you're interested, there are 2 recent reviews where some of these problems are discussed. So this is a review that we wrote with Martin Evans and Gregory Scher, who is my colleague at Paris. All right, so this is the sort of summary of this, this simple toy model of a single particle. So now let me just tell you a recent experiment. I know you guys are mathematicians, so you are probably not interested in experiments, but still it's quite interesting because it leads to new questions. So the experiments was two recent experiments, one from the group of E.L. Roitman from Tel Aviv, as I mentioned before, and the second one is from the group of Sergio Siliberto from École Normale at Lyon, and I was involved with them, so I can just briefly describe to you. So main idea of the experiment is the following. So essentially what you do, how do you actually do the resetting in experimental setup? So what they do is actually they take an optical trap. These days you can actually fabricate optical trap very easily with lasers. So you have a single particle, so it diffuses, and at some random time you switch on the optical trap. So when you switch on the optical trap, that means it traps the particle. It's like an external potential trapping the particle, diffusion and external potential. And then the particle is sort of goes to the stationary state of this potential. And during that time, you don't make the measurement. So this is the roughly the picture. So you let it diffuse for random time, and then you switch on the optical trap. This is the red part is when the optical trap is switched on, and you let the particle relax to its thermal state. Which means the Gibbs-Boltzmann equilibrium, which is the Gaussian distribution for harmonic trap, Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process essentially. You let it go there, and during that time, you don't make any measurements. Okay. So this sort of mimics the resetting essentially. And then again, you switch off the optical trap and they let the particle diffuse and for some random time. And again, you switch on the trap. So you alternate these two states essentially. And in fact, so the difference is that, unlike the theory, and this is a sort of new question because, you don't, in theory, we are always in the model, we're always resetting to the initial position, but it's not necessary. You can actually, choose to reset to a position which you draw from some distribution. And that's exactly what the experiment is telling us, that you actually reset not to a point, but you choose the resetting point from some Gaussian distribution, which is the equilibrium distribution of the particle in the trap. Okay. So you can then ask, what happens when I introduce this additional length scale sigma here, which is related to the temperature. Okay. So that means I can control this length scale. So I basically, instead of resetting to a particular point, I'm resetting to a whole distribution. I'm choosing the resetting position from a distribution, which is this Gaussian distribution with a length scale sigma. And in this finite width sigma, it sort of leads to new interesting effects on the mean first passage time. I'll not go into the details, but you can actually compute again exactly this mean first passage time in the presence of a finite sigma. And what you find is very interesting, and this is the result from experiments and compared to the theory. So the sigma here, it introduces a new length scale. So you have another additional parameter, if you like, a dimensionless parameter, which is the L. L is the distance to the target, and divided by the width of this potential, L over sigma. And it turns out that, so when sigma is 0, that means like in the model, when sigma is 0, that means B is infinite. Then you have just a curve which I showed you before. This is the mean first passage time plotted as a function of the resetting rate R. So you should see a minimum here, unique minimum, and the maximum on both sides. This happens when B is infinity, that is sigma is 0. Now as you increase the sigma, by in experiments you can control this sigma. As you increase the sigma, that means you reduce the B value from infinity, what you find is that it has a minimum, it goes up, but then it achieves a maximum, and then again starts going down as R goes to infinity, resetting rate goes to infinity. So there is an additional maximum which appears. So the curve actually looks much more non-trivial. And then as you increase the sigma further, that means as B reduces, and then for B less than some critical value, BC, which you can compute explicitly, this maximum disappears, and you have a only minimum that appears at R equal to infinity. Which means, and this is physically, it's easy to understand because when you have a finite sigma, that means target has a finite width around it. So when you reset, you don't reset to a position, you reset to a sort of variable length essentially. And just by resetting, if you reset it often, you might find the target without the need for an additional diffusion. Okay. And that is why you have an additional minimum at R star equal to infinity. And this phase transition is new, which actually came from experiments, motivated by the experimental results. Experiment was done before we actually computed analytically this critical value point here. So this is in physics, sometimes it's called the spin-orbital transition. Spin-orbital transition means that this is the point where the second derivative, both first and second derivative vanishes, and you essentially have a monotonically decreasing function of this. All right. So this is the, so now let me, in the next few minutes, let me just try to make a generalization. So far I was talking about a single particle problem. I want to generalize to many body systems. So how do we generalize to many body systems? As I said, the stochastic resetting is a very, very sort of general concept. I mean, you can have any system, either a single particle or many body system, and it's dynamic. It has its natural dynamics, which can be either deterministic or stochastic, classical or quantum, whatever you want. Okay, so I'm schematically representing it here. So it has its own evolution, and then at sort of random points, random times, basically. Okay, you reset to the initial configuration. Okay, or to some configuration drawn from some distribution, and then you restart the dynamics again, natural dynamics. And so it's a renewal process essentially, and you choose this random time from some distribution, and the most common distribution is this Poissonian resetting, just with one parameter r. But you can do whatever distribution you want. And so you can actually do it for, not just for a single particle, but you can do it for many particle system or, many body system and so on. So for instance, I mean, you can take, many body system like Ising model. So Ising model is just a bunch of spins with some interactions between them. And people study, Ising model dynamics, where you flip a spin according to some rates, which depend on the local configuration. This is called the globodynamics. Or you can take fluctuating interfaces, where you have the heights of the interfaces are basic degrees of freedom. Okay, interface. So essentially, configuration in this many body system is specified by some degrees of freedom. In the cases of interfaces, the heights are different lattice points, if you like. So you can think of a lattice, and each lattice side you have a height, and these heights are moving according to some dynamics. It could be Edwards-Wilkinson's or so-called the Kardar-Parisi-Chang equation, whatever equation you like. So these are the basic degrees of freedom for the interfaces. And for the Ising model, of course, the basic degrees of freedom are the spins at different lattice sites. Okay. So these guys, they are moving, according to some dynamics. And then what you do is natural dynamics, and then you just do the resetting. That means at some random time, you go back to the starting configuration. The whole configuration goes back to the initial configuration at constant rate r, let's say Poissonian resetting. And you keep doing this. Okay, then you evolve, and again you go back, you evolve, go back, etc. And again, you can ask the same question, that is, what happens to the long time limit? So let's say PR, subscript r means in the presence of resetting. So PR of CT, so this is the probability that the system is in configuration C at time t. Okay. And so again, I can use the, basic renewal approach, which is the following. So this probability that the system is in configuration C at time t in the presence of resetting r. Again, there is this term here, which corresponds to no resetting. And this is the sort of natural dynamics. For the case of single particle diffusing, it was just a Gaussian propagator. In general, it will be P0 of CT without resetting. This is the case of no resetting up to time t. And then when you have one or more resettings up to time t, again, you have to look back, again, using the renewal approach, you have to look back the last time resetting occurred, and the probability for that is this. And then since that time, it's just a free evolution in the absence of resetting, and you have to integrate over 0 to t. So this equation is more general, and it holds for anything, any system, many body system if you like. And again, in the long time limit, as long as this integral here exists, you have a stationary state, which is a non-equilibrium stationary state in this many body context. Of course, difficult thing is to compute this. So this is the key equation. We should remember this. And of course, so I mean, for this to calculate this stationary state, to characterize this stationary state, you need to know the full dynamics at all time tau of the system without resetting, okay? Which often is very hard to calculate for many body system. Okay, but okay, there are some progresses have been made for this kind of system, fluctuating interfaces in 1+1 dimension, symmetric exclusion processes, then n-independent Brownian motions, Ising model, etc. And I'll just focus on only one thing, just because this is the simplest example, which is this n-independent Brownian motion. And I'll show you, that it leads to sort of non-trivial results in the stationary state. And so this is a recent work which is done by my graduate student Marco Biroli in collaboration with Hernan Laralde and Gregory Scher. So what is this model? Again, this model was sort of motivated by experiments Because in the experiment, earlier I showed you just one particle. But in real experiments, what happens, there are more than one particles usually. These are colloidal particles in a fluid. So you have more than one particles, and typically you can tune the interaction, you can set the interaction to be 0. So imagine the simplest case is they are totally non-interacting. Okay? So these particles are non-interacting Brownian motion. Okay? They can cross, of course. And then you evolve them up to a random time tau, and then you switch on the optical trap, okay, and let them relax, which mimics this instantaneous resetting. I'm taking sigma to be 0. That means I'm resetting them all to one point, and then again switch off the trap, and then evolve and switch on the trap, and so on. Okay? So in terms of model, this is a very, very simple model. So you have n independent Brownian motions. You start from the origin. This is a space-time diagram. And I evolve them up to a random time t. And then I simultaneously reset them because they are all in the same trap. So they get simultaneously reset to the origin for simplicity. And then I again evolve them up to a random time. I reset them back to the origin simultaneously. And I do this, keep on doing this. Okay. So the point is that the simultaneous resetting, so the system in the long time limit, it reaches a stationary state. And I want to calculate, for example, that in the presence of the resetting rate R, what is the joint distribution of the positions of all these n particles? Okay. And again, from the simple expression that I wrote down there, the general expression is so this is without resetting, the probability of a configuration. So without resetting, and the tau has the interpretation of the time since the last resetting. Okay, so that's the general result. And therefore, so without resetting, they're independent. So therefore, you just have a product of Gaussians, okay, I equal to 1 to n. But then you have to do this integral e to the power minus r tau d tau, and this is the stationary state in the long time limit. So tau is the time since the last resetting. So, but the point is that you see that this stationary distribution, it does not factorize. Okay? While it factorizes inside the integral, once you do this integral, because they all share this common factor tau, which is a random variable drawn from exponential distribution. So therefore, the joint distribution of the stationary state, they are not factorizable, which means that there is a non-trivial correlations between the particles, and it's easy to understand these correlations is generated by the simultaneous resetting. It's like, in the seminar room, we are all imagine that we are all independent, but each of us carries a bell, and when the bell rings, we have to all come back to the seminar room, okay? And if that happens all the time, then you actually get correlated, okay? And so therefore, this is a kind of correlated resetting gas, if you like. So in the stationary state, these are the positions of particles, the point process, and this point process has a non-trivial stationary state, and it does not factorize, okay? And and this is generated by the simultaneous resetting. So the interactions in the stationary state, they are not built in, but they are generated by the dynamics itself, and it persists all the way to the stationary state. And this gas is strongly correlated, and there's an all-to-all attraction, because attractive all-to-all interaction, you can actually compute from this expression, you can compute the correlation function like this very easily. I mean, I'm talking about square here, because if by symmetry, if you just take xi, xj, and the connected part of it, it will vanish because these are symmetric in xi, symmetric functions of xi. So you need to go to the next order, so xi square, xj squared. So this connected part is non-zero. And for any pair of particles ij, that means all these particles, they are very attractive all-to-all interaction in this stationary state. Okay? So, and but the nice thing is that even though this is a strongly correlated point process, okay, but you can actually calculate all the observables, different physical observables exactly, because of this particular, this conditionally independent IID structure. So this is, we call it conditional IID variables, because conditioned on tau, they are IID, but when you integrate over tau, this parameter, then they become stationary, okay? So essentially, to compute any observable, what you have to do is to compute it inside the integral with the parameter tau. So this is for an ideal gas, and it's very easy to IID variables. You can calculate any observable. So for example, you can ask for the average density, you can ask for the distribution order statistics. That means I ordered them x1, x2, x3, xn on a line, and I ask what is the distribution of the kth maximum. K equal to 1 is the rightmost particle position. You can ask for the spacing distribution between particles, two particles, what is the distribution of the gap between the two particles. Or you can ask full counting statistics. So this means basically that so you have a this point process on a line. So full counting statistics means I take an interval, say let's say minus L to plus L, and I ask how many particles are there inside this interval and what's the distribution of that. Spacing means you look for the distribution of the gap between the particles, and order statistics means just look at the kth maximum. And I'm looking at these observables because I have some background in random matrix theory, and there it's when you look at the eigenvalue distributions of a random matrix, these are sort of very natural questions that people ask there. Okay, and so you can ask the same question because in the case of random matrix, again you have a strongly correlated point process, and here again we have this, but for this it's much simpler to calculate all these observables. So I'm not going to the details of the computation, but just to show you some results. So for example, average density, which is just the expectation value of just count how many particles are there between x and x plus dx, normalized to 1. So this is just the marginal of the joint distribution. You integrate over all the positions and just keep one of them to be x. And this is of course trivially just the one particle distribution which you already computed, which is just exponential minus alpha naught mod x. Okay. And but you can ask other questions. So for example, what you can show is that the maximum typically scales like square root of log n for large n, and the gap between the first maximum and the second maximum scales like 1 over square root of log n. And in the bulk, this is near the edge, and in the bulk, the separation between the particles is typically order 1 over n. So again, without going to the details, let me just show you. So for example, if I look at the distribution of the position of the rightmost particle, the maximum, probability that maximum equal to W, so this is the PDF basically. So it has a scaling form. This is a function of W over ln. And this function, ln is this, as I said, it scales like square root of log n. But if you scale it, the scaling function is actually very simple. It's just 2z e to the power minus z squared. So it's like a Wigner function, if you like. But this is for the maximum itself, okay, not for the spacing. And so it goes to 0 as z goes to 0, and it has a Gaussian decay for large z. And this is numerical simulation compared with the analytical prediction. And you can actually compute also, for example, the gap between the two rightmost particles here. This gap distribution also has a scaling form with a scaling function, which is given by this somewhat non-trivial form, and which has a tail, which decays like exponential minus z to the power 3 by 2. So faster than exponential. So what you see here is that this scaling function, it does not go to 0, unlike in the random matrix theory. Random matrix theory, the eigenvalues repel each other, so the spacing distribution goes to 0 as the argument goes to 0. But here they are attractive gas, so it doesn't go to 0, so it goes to a constant and so on. All right, so and then you can ask other physical problems again motivated by experiments. So for example, you can take this n particles in a harmonic well, and instead of switching on and off, what you do is you go from one. So this is like a harmonic potential with stiffness mu1 and mu2. So you just switch between mu1 and mu2 with rate r1 and r2. Okay? And again, because the particles are in the same trap, they actually get correlated in time. Or the second protocol, this is the first protocol, and the second protocol is that again, it's the same system. You take the n particles in a harmonic well, non-interacting particles, and you take the trap center and you just give a stochastic motion to the trap center. And that drives the system again into a non-equilibrium stationary state. And but both these protocols, they all have the same conditional IID structure. That means basically that that essentially inside there's a parameter u. They all share. I'm not showing you the details. They all share the same parameter u. And inside this condition on u, this is a totally IID structure. But then u is drawn from some distribution H of U, that depends on the protocol, and which in these two cases you can compute explicitly. And that leads to, again, a sort of solvable but strongly correlated point process for any finite n. Okay. And so this is the sort of new thing that came out of this, that this physics tells us that this emergence of this conditional IID structure, which is very nice because you can actually generate a whole class of problems with a solvable point process, but they are rather simple and you can calculate observables explicitly. Now, one question you can ask that, given a problem, how do I know whether it has a CIID structure or not? That means whether there's a hidden parameter U such that when you integrate you get this, otherwise they're IID. Now this is a sort of, the necessary and sufficient condition for that is still an open problem mathematically. There's a theorem due to definite a long time back, but that holds only when n is infinite, and that was only for binary variables. So for a generic problem like this, for finite n, what is the necessary and sufficient condition for CIID structure? That is a sort of interesting open mathematical problem which we have no clue for the moment. We know some examples where you can do, but in many examples, for example, this example, it was not at all obvious that the stationary state has this CIID structure. We just found it from some integral representation of it using some Kestrel approach and so on. But it's not always easy. Even if you have the explicit stationary distribution, it's not always easy to see that whether it has a conditional IID structure. Okay, so let me now finish my talk with a summary and conclusion. So I just gave you a brief and partial overview of stochastic resetting. So it's a rapidly evolving field of research with many applications. It leads to new non-equilibrium stationary state. It has unusual temporal relaxation with a second-order dynamical phase transition. And the search of a stationary target via diffusion and resetting is efficient search strategy because there is an optimal resetting rate R star. Experiments led to new interesting questions, spinodal phase transition, for example, and you can generalize to any body systems, and in particular, this non-trivial correlated resetting gas with a conditional IID structure. So let me just finish very rapidly. I'll not go into the details, but so there are many other directions in which people are using stochastic resetting. You can ask for the geometrical properties, for example, territory covered by a resetting Brownian motion, like animal movements and so on. You can ask for the statistics of span, convex hull, number of distinct sites visited, etc. People are studying also resetting with memory. Of course, in the presence of memory, these processes become non-Markovian, and it's much more hard to compute the first passage properties and so on. And then with constraints, in some cases, you have resetting Brownian bridges, for example, and their optimal properties, they are also interesting. First passage resetting, that means you don't reset at random time, but you reset only when it reaches a certain level, and then you reset. So this is called first passage resetting. Then in the stochastic optimal control theory, there is a lot of applications there. And then the people are also interested in the cost of resetting, because resetting is a long-range move. So to execute that, you need to, there's a cost associated with that. And so that is, and then resetting in many-body classical systems. And more recently, there's a lot of work in quantum many-body systems, which I don't have time to talk about. But again, the idea is simple. You just, take a quantum unitary evolution of a state, and you reset the state by measurement or something, and then you go to a new stationary state in long-time limit. Let me acknowledge my collaborator. So this is the sort of main take-home message, that stochastic resetting is a very rich and interesting subject with static and dynamical phenomena. There was a special issue in JFISA, and there are many interesting articles there if you are interested to look at some of them. So these are my students, and Francisco Murillo was particularly involved, who is now a postdoc at Oxford. And then there are many other people, including Luca Giugioli, who is present here in the audience. And thank you very much for your interest.
Questions?
In the experiments, so is the time between the resets also still just an exponential?
Yeah, they can easily do it. They can actually do different protocols. They have done both with exponential and also stroboscopically, meaning that with fixed period, basically. And in all cases, you see this phenomena. It doesn't depend so much. Quantitatively it differs, but qualitatively it doesn't differ.
Yeah, thanks for a nice talk. Is it known whether, so we know that the mean first passage time can be optimized for resetting as kind of a random walk.
Right.
So one is if I have an anomalous walk, so if I have a super diffusive
Yes.
walk or a subdiffusive,
Yes.
is it known how, how much better is it? Is there some kind of...
So these people have studied. So for example, for Levy walks, Levy flights, for example, I mean, you can actually compute this explicitly. And it turns out, again, there can be a phase transition, for example. I mean, for example, when you index, if you have a Levy flight with the index mu, basically, and the mu is between 0 and 2, and when you change the value of mu, there is again, below a value of mu star, it turns out there is a non-zero R star, but beyond a certain value of mu, the R star goes to 0. So you can have a phase transition in R star itself, thinking of R star as an order parameter by changing some parameters and so on. So this happens studied. Yes.
Yeah. So that you mentioned stochastic resetting with memories. So
Yes.
do you have any guess of what will happen if, for instance, when searching for something, you don't repeat the trajectories, you start inspecting in other places?
Absolutely. So the one model which I cited here, which was basically started by Denis Boyer and collaborators. Yeah. So this is the first model which was studied. So in this model, the model is very simple. So you take a one-dimensional random walk, let's say on a lattice for simplicity, and at step n, okay. So let's say with probability p by 2, you go to the right. With probability p by 2, you go to the left. And with the remaining probability, 1 minus p, you reset to a site. But when you reset to a site, you actually look at only, so what you do is you pick up any, if you are step n, you pick up any time step before that with uniform probability, okay? So let's say I look at the kth step with probability 1 over n, okay? And at that kth step, wherever you were in the history, you go back there, basically. So that means basically, you choose the previously visited sites with a probability proportional to the number of visits to the local time in that site, basically. And this leads, so basically what happens with time, the walk tends to get localized, but it doesn't reach a stationary state. What it does, it grows, at late times it still has a Gaussian distribution, but the width grows like log t, so anomalously slow. So e to the power minus x square over log t essentially. Okay. So typical distance goes like square root of log t. So very, very slow. It still grows, but very, very slow, basically. And but this is the position distribution. But first passage properties in this model is completely open. Nobody has any clue.
Thank you very much. So I think I missed something probably very simple. So why is this search time diverging as r goes to 0? I think I understand why it should not itself go to 0, but I missed why.
No, when r goes to 0,
itself, yeah.
when r goes to, you just have a Brownian diffusion, right? Just a Brownian diffusion. If there is no resetting, you just have a Brownian diffusion. So the mean first passage time is infinite. Yes.
I think the very last problem you mentioned, where you change environment,
Yes.
it's also studied in probability with kind of population biology. It's called fluctuating random environment or switch to dynamical systems. So I don't know whether you know that literature.
I know a little bit of that literature, but I mean, I have not seen this particular model there studied. Maybe we can discuss that. Yeah, that would be nice to know. Yes, certainly. I mean, what people study is something what is called the elephant random walk, but this is different from this one.
No.
It's not the same. Okay, sorry. Okay. We can talk. Yeah, please.
I would like to ask you the following question. So, this moment of resettings are renewal epochs.
Yes.
And different of stationary distribution can be proved probably from the general theory if these times are not exponential, but IID.
Absolutely. So, I mean, if you, for example, you can take a power law distribution of this P of tau, okay, and not exponential, but power law with a algebraic tail, basically.
And you have a result about density and change of the mode.
Yeah.
Some density before, some critical level.
Yeah, so I mean, people have studied for all kinds of, when you choose this, the time interval to reset from some arbitrary distribution, okay?
But for non-exponential, do
Yeah, for non-exponential, there are some results there, okay? So stationary state exists only for certain values of parameter, and then beyond that, it doesn't exist. There is no stationary state. Okay.
And I also have one question about expectation of time.
Yes.
As a function of exponential distribution. Is it convex in general setting? I mean, if you consider some strong Markov process and then reset.
Yeah. You want to know?
Yeah, it's clear that time.
I mean, at least all the examples I know, it's a convex function, but in principle, you can actually. I mean, there is nothing to tell you that there is only single minimum, for example. Okay. I mean, you can have, for example, there are examples where you can have two minimum and things like it's possible. So it's not always completely convex. Yes.
Okay. One last question.
So in your very simplest model,
Yeah.
You derive an optimum resetting rate.
Right.
And that was a function of the distance between your
Yes.
where you reset and where your target is.
Sure.
But if you're
How would I know if I don't know the target, right? Absolutely. No, this is a very standard question. So let me answer this question. So first thing, you know that this optimal R star, it depends only on x naught squared, the distance squared. Okay. So for example, in one dimension, the target can still be either on the left or right. You don't know which way. Okay. But let's say you know roughly the distance. Okay. So then it's still useful to set to this optimal resetting rate, but it becomes more and more important in higher dimensions. Because I tell you that the canteen is 1 kilometer away. I don't tell you which direction. Okay. So but then because there also it depends only on the actual the distance, but not on the angle. Okay, the R star. So if you have roughly one idea that that is 1 kilometer away, but you don't know which way to go, then you can actually use this R star. And that will be still very beneficial, basically.